Yeah, kind of sit back and enjoy the lecture. All right, so last week we learned about World War One, and so we talked about the five causes. Now, these questions on this review will be on the quiz that you guys have next week. So make sure you're well versed and you have a quiz on World War One and Two next week. It's pretty lengthy, so just make sure you've got these down. The five causes. Remember the acronym MANIA. You can go back and review last week's presentation if you've forgotten what that stands for. Which nations were allied in World War One? For the purpose of the test, we call them the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente. And this gets a little confusing because the allies of World War II are actually the Triple Entente, and then your Triple Alliance is the Central Powers. So make sure you've got those down. What year did the U.S. enter World War One? And I believe you need to know the date and year for that, April 1917. And what was the name of the treaty that was signed at the end of World War One? Of course, Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. You guys are writing about that this week in your discussion. I believe someone has actually already posted about it, so that is fabulous. Okay, so what was World War II? It's the largest war in human history. It involved countries, colonies, and territories around the entire world. And by the end, over 70 million were dead, and it lasted from 1939 to 1945. That date is on your test, so you need to know World War II, 1939 to 1945. Now, before 1939, many things happened leading up to the war. And that's what I'm going to try to cover at the beginning of this presentation and then kind of get into what happened during the war and how it concluded. So World War One and the Treaty of Versailles was a cause because Germany was blamed for a number of things, and they had to pay more reparations than most other countries. You have an article that's kind of colloquially known as the War Guilt Clause, and so that's one of the reasons. You also have appeasement, which you've probably heard of. Appeasement is sort of giving someone what they want so that they'll leave you alone, kind of like your little brother or sister has ever come in your room and you want them to go away, so you give them a cookie or a toy or something. And so that's kind of in a very simple way what happened with Hitler, which I'll explain also as we go along. And the rise of totalitarianism. So many people, many scholars argue that Hitler never could have come to power if we weren't in the middle of the totalitarian age. And so there's an element there as well. Now, Germany, you have this Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War One, and Article 231 is known as that War Guilt Clause. Now, this part of the treaty is the legal statement that explains which war damages Germany was responsible to pay for. And so the German economy went into this downward spiral, and things got pretty bad pretty quickly. And so imagine, if the price of bread rose, between 9 a.m. in the morning and 2 p.m. in the afternoon, that's hyperinflation. And that was something like what they were experiencing. Now, Germany lost land to surrounding nations. They had to pay somewhere in the ballpark of 57 trillion as a modern day equivalent. And the Germans are bankrupt. They're embarrassed. It makes their country look bad, right? They're guilt ridden. They're angry, which all describes a lot of what Hitler was feeling when he was coming to power. And so at the time, you've got desperate people turning to desperate leaders. When things are going bad, you want a leader to rise up and fix the problem, right? And so that's kind of what we have going on here. Now, appeasement, like I said, is giving someone something to make them happy and leave you alone. And so Hitler demanded land that wasn't Germany's. Now, one of the sources on that primary source list in the reading and study materials is a song, a patriotic song from Germany called The Watch on the Rhine. And it's essential to say that the Rhine River was important to the Germans. It was considered a national border. They had patriotic ties to it. Many people felt that when it was taken from them, in the Treaty of Versailles that that was very wrong, and they wanted it back. They wanted that Rhine region back. And so I encourage you guys to go through and just read the song. You can listen to them sing it. I don't know if there's a version in English. I think most of the on YouTube you can find German versions of it, and it really shows how much they love that river and how those who were very patriotic felt about it. And so you have here Neville Chamberlain. He's the Prime Minister of Britain, and he comes home from making a deal with Hitler, where he appeased Hitler, and he gives a speech to the British people in which he says, "Go home and sleep peacefully in your beds. It's peace in our time." And of course, we know this is not true. Hitler's strategy was to talk peace and fool the people around him, but he planned for war. And when you read Hitler's Ober-Salzberg speech, which is also included in the primary sources, you really see Hitler's personality coming out and what he thinks of the surrounding nations. It's actually almost comical, some of the things he says, although not comical knowing that he actually acted on these things. But I encourage you guys to read it just so you get a handle on that. Now, what is totalitarianism? So we talked about some of the causes. It's basically, you know, the word total is in the word. So it's where a state and its leader have total control. There's no right to vote, no free speech. The government controls the economy, and there's often a police state. Now, totalitarianism can look different in various countries. And what you had going on at the time of World War II is you have the USSR as a communist dictatorship, which is basically economic control. You have Germany and Italy are fascist dictatorships, which means essentially ideological control. And then military dictatorship in Japan. So military control, obviously. And so fascism is an essential to understand when we're talking about Germany and Italy. Fascism developed under Mussolini of Italy, not under Hitler. Mussolini actually wrote an encyclopedic article that explains what he thought fascism was. I believe that's listed in your primary sources. If it's not, I'll have to go back and add it because I would like for you guys to read and study it. But his definition has changed over time. Even he came back later in his life and said he wanted to change the definition that he wrote. And so fascism can be defined in the eye of the beholder, but the symbol for fascism is a bundle of wheat. And the idea is that each individual citizen is like a stalk of wheat, and you bundle them up together, you get them all to think the same thing. And the idea is like the individual is not as important as the state itself. And so we have to bundle them up and get them all on the same page so that the state can advance, right? And you see that a lot with the ideologies of World War II. Now, here are your main leaders. You've got Hitler of Germany, of course, Mussolini of Italy, and then you've got Toho of Japan and Stalin of the USSR. And so I kind of just went through this. I'm going to skip that. Here's some pictures of what fascist Germany looked like. I'm sure you've seen things like this before. These are rather popular photos. So you may have even seen some of these before, but you've got, you know, the Nazi stormtroopers here. You can see how vast they were. And you've got a lot of people with the Hail Hitler. You've got the Nazi standard here, Hitler coming out, and just things. You know, it's just kind of interesting. Whole books have been written about how Hitler was able to get this many people to follow him on such a scale. And, you know, you have all the extermination and things going on, and especially the soldiers who were privy to the things and the concentration camp workers. There are questions about how these things came about and why people were so willing. And there's an argument called the functionalist versus intentionalist approach. And so I'll post something about that in a separate announcement just so you guys have it. And I encourage you guys to study that and kind of look into it and determine what you think about it using primary sources and other scholarly articles as well. Maybe read the books that I'm going to mention in the post. So you've got the German Empire. I'm going to back up just a little bit. You can see the Rhineland here. And so this is part of what was taken from them. And you've got the Sudetenland here. Now, Germany was one of the last countries to unify, which sort of made them very patriotic in and of itself. Now, what did Hitler actually want, right? Well, he wanted to build up his military. He wanted the Rhineland back, and he wanted Lebensraum or living space. And so Austria annexed peacefully in 1938, right? And the Sudetenland, which is Czechoslovakia, also was annexed. And so then he was on to Poland. And so, like I said, you can kind of go back to this map. You can see the Rhineland, you can see the Sudetenland. I often think of Germany, and this is sort of a rudimentary way to say it, but it looks like Mrs. Pac-Man, and she's eating the Czech Republic today. So if you forget where she's located, that's kind of a fun way to remember it. So Germany invaded Poland, and that was the official start of World War II. Now, the Allies, after this, declared war on Germany, and Germany then invaded France, and Belgium, and then he invaded Russia. And so he used this tactic called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. So, in other words, he was going to do this super fast. And that was really the only way it would work, is if he came in and overtook so quickly that no one could really stop him. He surrounded them with tanks and troops and things. And this is not so different from what Vladimir Putin tried to do to Ukraine just recently. I think he was also not to compare him to Hitler, but he was using this tactic of quick war. And as we can see in that scenario, it kind of becomes a stalemate after a while. And these are like they call these antique methods of warfare now, right? Like new methods are more subtle. You've got infiltration of technology, maybe an attack on the power grid, or spying, espionage, things like that. So the idea of tanks and guns and things is really sort of archaic in our time, but it was very innovative in Hitler's time. So, who's on each side in World War II, right? So you've got Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And then you've got Allied powers, Great Britain, Soviet Union, United States, and France. France surrendered to Germany in 1940. So remember, the war started in 1939. That was only like 6 weeks into it. So they didn't last very long, but they were technically still an ally, even, they were a conquered ally. And so here's a picture of Hitler and Mussolini kind of hanging out in the car together. And again, I encourage you to read the Ober-Salzberg speech to kind of get a feel of what Hitler thought of his opponents. And so at the beginning of World War I, Germany was a constitutional monarchy. It's the Weimar Republic, and it was so incredibly strong and stable that it lasted for 2 whole years. And Hitler spent 10 years after his arrest building up his political party. He was arrested and charged with treason in 1923 for a political uprising. It was known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And he spent 10 years after that arrest writing Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. It's sort of his autobiography. I encourage you to read it. I know a lot of people don't really want to read Mein Kampf. They say, oh, I'm getting into the mind of a madman and things like that. And yes, it is true. He was pretty deranged. But at the same time, if you really want to understand why he did what he did, read Mein Kampf, and it will begin to make sense to you how he thought. You probably won't agree. I hope you don't agree with a lot of his points, but it definitely gives you insight and especially with that functionalist versus intentionalist approach. If you really want to understand that, read Mein Kampf, because that will give you you're getting the information from the source itself, and that'll tell you what he really thought. So in 1929, you have the stock market crash in the US, and you would think this doesn't matter so much in Europe, but it actually does. I told you earlier the German economy wasn't doing well, and so this just sent them into a tailspin, right? Because it sent ripple effects across the entire world, especially in the West. And so you have this going on, and the people are in a panic. And so the German Chancellor Heinrich Brüning was unable to get the Reichstag, which is the parliament, to back his plans. And so he persuaded the German president, Paul von Hindenburg, to invoke Article 48 of the German Constitution. Now, Article 48 allowed the president to govern by decree in a state of emergency. And so this caused many people to follow Hitler and his Nazi party. And Hitler gained quite a following, but he lost election after election. And so, just when he thought he had lost, he was nominated chancellor by Franz von Papen, the current chancellor. Now, if you have a rival and they have a lot of followers, If you can get them on your side, guess what's going to happen? Their followers become your followers because you're a team, right? And so that's kind of what happened here. Papen wanted to get Hitler's followers on his side, and so he kind of befriended Hitler, gave him this position, thinking that Hitler couldn't do too much harm if he was under the umbrella of these other people. And so I think it's a common misconception that Hitler seized power. It was really just handed over to him. And the German government thought that Hitler couldn't do much harm if he was surrounded by officials who were not part of the Nazi Party, as I said. Now, Hitler's position of chancellor was not very strong, and so in order to strengthen it, he went after the Communist Party first. Now, this is also a common misconception. A lot of people think Hitler was a communist because you have the word socialist in the Nazi name, right? And so there's another party in Germany, and they were known as the Social Democratic Party. They were the Marxists. And when you read Mein Kampf, you'll see Hitler didn't like them at all. Hitler wanted a cultural socialism, which is different from an economic socialism. His economy was more of a monopoly capitalism, where he kind of like consolidated as much capital as he could and put it into his war machines. And so, kind of make that distinction. He didn't like the communists, and they were actually the first ones to go to the concentration camps. Now, on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building burned down and Hitler saw an opportunity. And so while many suspected the Nazi Party, he blamed these communists and he sent them to the first concentration camp. Now, by the end of 1933, Hitler crippled the Communist Party completely, and by 1945, he had murdered about 150,000 communists. Now, the Reichstag fire gave Hitler the ability to dismantle what was left of Germany's democracy. And so in March of 1933, he convinced the Reichstag to pass the enabling law. And this law, quote, enabled Hitler to put into place any measure he wished without approval from the Reichstag. By the end of the summer of 1933, Hitler had used his authority to disable every political party except his Nazi party. He was quite a methodology there. He had quite a methodology. And so as he began sending people to concentration camps, and this is where, again, that functionalist versus intentionalist approach comes in. The functionalist approach says that he didn't really intend to target the Jews. They were the last group that he sent in. And so the intentionalist approach says that he intended on the Jews all along and used these other groups as a way to test the waters. And so it depends on where you land on that. He did want to create a perfect society. Eugenics was part of that. And so, you've got this issue here. And probably the best way to say this is to show you the chart on the next page. So you've got different colors. I think we're all probably familiar with the Jewish star, but you also have other codes. If you were a political enemy, you would wear a red triangle. If you're a habitual criminal, you would wear a green triangle. Immigrants had a blue triangle. Jehovah's Witnesses. My sister is a Jehovah's Witness. I could tell you a lot about what they believe, and they do not believe in supporting the government. They don't say the pledge. They don't vote. They just think that, God's kingdom is not of this world, so you don't get involved with that. And so because they didn't support the government, Hitler didn't like them, and so they were targeted. And gay males, not females, because females were not allowed to serve in government. And I think that's really what he was looking at here. The men were, and so he was keeping gay males out of government. You have asocials. Roma and Sinti people are known as gypsies. There's a possibility they have Arabic descent somewhere. I'm not really sure exactly. You guys can look into that if you like. But he also targeted groups like the Freemasons. The Freemasons allowed Jews into the upper echelons of their organization. And so, you have all these people that he just felt like were detrimental to German society and they had to go. And so the Jews, of course, were the largest group that was targeted. And like I said, the functionalist versus intentionalist approach argues if he actually intended them all along and these other groups were just a byproduct, or if he really wanted to get rid of all of these groups to create this utopian society. And so, when little protest was held against the violent way that Nazi stormtroopers handled the homosexual men, he moved on to his next target, which was the Jehovah's Witnesses. And, at the time, religious groups like Protestants and Catholics were in support of this. And I don't think they knew the scale of the concentration camp system at that time. They just kind of felt like these people should be shunned from society. They're looked at as a cult, they're not mainstream Christians. And so it was pretty easy, when you already have sort of this connotation of certain people in society, it's easy to move the needle a little bit where you want it to go. And so you also have this fear tactic. So he's got these stormtroopers or brown shirts, sometimes they're called. And so they numbered almost 400,000 by 1932. There was a lot of propaganda, and you had indoctrination and education of the young, which is a program called Hitler Youth. Mein Kampf, I already discussed. Here's a photo of it. Again, you can read it for free online if you're interested in that. And so Hitler's method was subtle at first. He made the Jews and other oppressed groups outcast of society. Jewish goods were boycotted, and eventually he called off the boycott because it was ruining his reputation. Now you're into phase two, routinization. And so by 1934, the Nazi regime passed laws to centralize power. And you have August 1934, President Hindenburg, the man who appointed Hitler chancellor, had died. And so Hitler then united the offices of president and chancellor to make them into one. And by the fall of 1935, Hitler passed the Nuremberg laws. And so basically, it forbade the marriage of Germans and Jews. And I'm going to show you on this chart. It's a lot easier to see here. So you've got, certain levels of German ancestry. And so you could have marriages permitted in certain cases if the Jewish blood was not too thick. And in other cases, the marriage was strictly prohibited. So imagine having laws like that in your country. Again, it's related to eugenics and creating this perfect society. I'm going to come back to the Jews. I'm going to skip this and I'll do a little segment on Jewish history at the end. So in 1936, Hitler sent troops to take back a section of Germany, and that was set up as a buffer zone between Germany and France. And again, you see the Rhineland here in the map. And so France, who was struggling economically, they just didn't want to have a war, and they didn't do much about it. And so, remember that Hitler was actually not from Germany. He was from Austria. And so he wanted Germany and Austria to have unification ever since he was a teenager. And in 1938, he forced Austria's leader to resign. And so then this is called the Anschluss, which means to join. And so then he went after Czechoslovakia, and he made it out like he simply wanted to protect the people. Now, again, you've got Neville Chamberlain, who I mentioned at the beginning. He had that Peace in Our Time speech. And so in 1938, Chamberlain signed the Munich Pact, which gave Hitler permission to take the Sudetenland. That brings us to Kristallnacht. So now we're 1938. And so remember, the war begins in 1939. So I'm kind of going through all of these events before the war began, right? And so Kristallnacht means Night of Broken Glass. And in October of 1938, the German government expelled 14,000 Jews who were citizens of Germany but resided in Poland. And so Polish authorities refused the Jews' entry into Poland when they got to the border. So imagine if you're a Jew living at this time and you're literally in limbo because you don't know where you're going to live, you've been ousted from one country, the neighboring country won't let you in, and you're just, not in a good spot here. And so this is what Kristallnacht looked like. If you've ever read the Corrie ten Boom story, she talks about how they were clockmakers, watchmakers, right? And they had a business on the bottom floor and they lived on the top floor. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. So the business level, Night of Broken Glass, they broke the glass, they stole all the, looted the stores and things like that, and then sent the Jews packing. And this is an actual picture of what that looked like when it was over. And so then you have expansion of the concentration camp system. And open aggression happened in 1938, 1939. You did have Buchenwald in 1937. Ravensbrück was a camp only for women. And so it really gets into gear of like right on the eve of the war. And so Hitler's strategy was to talk peace but plan for war. He made pacts with the Vatican, and the Vatican. If you watch on Alexander Street, there's a really great video. It's called "Perspectives: Benito Mussolini," and it explains how the Vatican sort of came to be in Vatican City. You know that happened under Mussolini, and so Hitler made pacts with the Vatican, Poland, Italy, and Britain. And so, September 1st, 1939, you have Polish leadership fled to France by the end of September. And by 1939 and 1940, the euthanasia program got into full swing. Euthanasia means good death. And so this furthered Hitler's agenda by creating an Aryan race. And the term Aryan race is somewhat misleading. We think of like blonde haired, blue eyed people. Germans are not blonde hair and blue eyed people. And if you look at the photos of the Nazi concentration camp workers, sometimes it's hard to tell them apart from the Jews because they're dark haired, dark eyes. If you read Mein Kampf, again, you'll have a really good understanding of what Aryan is. And, you know, he wants the smartest and the best and the brightest. And he mentions in Mein Kampf the Japanese, which obviously is not blonde hair, blue eyed, right? And so it's more about innovative technologies and, you know, and he wants good people. That's also very interesting. Hitler considered himself an agent of God, and he thought that he was doing this noble and great thing, and he was going to clean up society. He talked about the Jews being involved in prostitution and things like that, and those were the kind of things he wanted to get out of society. So it's very interesting his viewpoint on all of this. Now, in late 1941, Hitler ordered a halt to the euthanasia program. People were kind of starting to realize what's going on and they're speaking out. And so it was a ploy. He just kind of stopped a large scale project and decentralized it into hospitals and smaller sites. And so by May of 1940, the German troops entered France, and by June 14th, German troops overtook Paris. Now, although France was one of Britain's greatest allies, Britain was not alone after France fell. They had the support of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And so here's a good map. Red on this map is full involvement in World War II. Purple participated. They bombed or had limited combat. You have orange participated with troops involved. You have yellow is neutral, but they took a side, and then the gray is neutral with no involvement at all. So there were a few countries who were not involved, but it was pretty slim in the pickings. Most people were involved in one way or another. And so Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in the late 1930s. Now, in terms of the US, we have this like isolationist policy, right? And so this goes all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine. We're not going to get involved in foreign affairs. And we kept that policy until about the time of Theodore Roosevelt, and he had the corollary. And then eventually we got involved with World War I because we felt we had to. And then we went back to our isolationist policies after World War I, but we had to abandon them again when World War II happened because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That's what really brought us into the war. And so I believe this date is on your test, December 7th, 1941. We were bombed by the Japanese, and the attack lasted an hour and 45 minutes. About 2,400 Americans died at Pearl Harbor. And so on December 8th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan. He wasted no time there. And so here's a picture of the bombing, which you may have seen. It's a rather popular photo. And so the Battle of Midway was fought in June of 1942. It was one of the most important naval battles. And I encourage you, there's a movie that was made called Midway. You may have seen it. I think it's like 3, 4 hours long. I know there's actually been two or three. I think one was made in the 80s, but there's a more recent one. I have seen the one from the 80s. I'll be honest, I haven't seen the new one, so I don't know how accurate it is, but I encourage you to watch it. It's an interesting if you're into military history and that kind of thing, it will be right up your alley. I will say I'm more of a political historian myself. I do enjoy military history. My soon-to-be son-in-law, my daughter gets married on Saturday. She's marrying a guy who's a historian, so we obviously just love him. But he is a military history buff all the way and can tell you all the things about all the planes and all the ammunition and guns and all of those wonderful things. I can tell you about political parties and and voting records and things like that. So kind of fun stuff. All right, so I put this heartwarming war story in the announcements, so I'll skip over that and let you guys go through that on your own if you wish. I highly encourage you to do that. It's a great story. And so that brings me to D-Day. So you've got, it's also known as Operation Overlord, and it stands for Secret Day. It was the turning point in the war, and it was a very covert operation, pretty well planned. And so on June 6, 1944, Allied nations invaded the beaches of Normandy, France. Now they chose this beach because it was a logical spot to invade. It was let me just show you on the next view. Here they are kind of getting off the ship. But they actually like snuck over and checked it out ahead of time. They got these sand samples. They like took submarines and got sand samples and took them back home and they analyzed them under a microscope and they tried to figure out which beach had the most compact sand that would be best for landing planes. And so that's kind of how they figured it out, which is very intelligent. They also built an underwater pipeline from England to Normandy to pump millions of gallons of fuel across the English Channel. Something happened with it. I don't think it worked quite the way they had hoped, but incredible endeavor. Additionally, they dressed these dolls up like soldiers, they're dummy paratroopers, and they dropped them on the opposite beach so that the Germans would think they were landing on one side, but they were actually landing on the other, and that worked for them. And so on the night before D-Day, two engine planes pulled silent gliders into France. They released the gliders and landed quietly with passenger soldiers, and they destroyed those bridges strategically. However, D-Day didn't start off in the way they'd hoped. Even with all of that planning, they landed at 4 a.m. and so it was dark and they couldn't see where they were going. And they ended up in the swamp instead of on the beach, which then caused them to have to walk inland. And so, even though they had this little hiccup, they still did very well. And I think Hitler knew at this point that it was just about over. D-Day was one of the major turning points. After this, you also had the Battle of the Bulge, and that sort of finished it off. It's kind of like downhill after that. And so when Hitler realized he'd been defeated, he committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. And he married his longtime sweetheart Eva Braun, and they committed suicide together. So he married her only days before the wedding. It's very tragic. Days before the suicide. I'm sorry. And so Hitler defined the Holy Roman Empire as the Third Reich. Or I'm sorry, Hitler defined his reign as the Third Reich. I'm totally switching gears to a different topic now, and I'm getting ahead of myself. So you've probably heard the term Third Reich, and so it's easiest to explain it when you look at it chronologically. I think my first thought when I read about it was, okay, what was the First Reich and what was the second one? And so the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which we study in World Civ 2 1500 and a little bit after. But basically, 962 to 1806 was the temporary range, I would say. And then you've got the German Empire, 1871 to 1918. So after unification, because remember, Germany was one of the last countries to unify. And then you've got the Third Reich, is supposedly Hitler's Nazi Germany, which never really took off. And so the Japanese, like I said at the beginning, were a military dictatorship, and so they believed that America would enslave and mistreat them if they won the war. And so two battles were fought after Hitler's death, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And FDR he had a stroke actually here in Georgia. FDR died at the Little White House, and if you've never been down there to tour it, I highly encourage you to do so. It's a really interesting museum they've got. You can walk through. You can see the room where he passed. They were painting a portrait of him at the time that he had that stroke, and so they've got it hanging up. It's unfinished. They call it the last portrait. They moved him from the sitting room into the bedroom and he died in the bed, and you can go through and see that room as well. But it left Harry Truman in a really tricky spot because all of a sudden, Truman had to decide if they were going to use the atomic bombs on Japan or not. And I don't think he was briefed very well. I think he was very much taken by surprise. FDR, at the time that he died, he was writing a speech that he was going to give. And I think everyone knew his health wasn't great. He had polio, he was in a wheelchair, he had definitely declined, but he felt like he was going to make it through at least to the end of his presidency. And so it was very surprising to everyone. And so Truman, of course, did decide to use the atomic bomb, and that has been a much debated issue among historians, even to this day. On April 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. And on April 9th, one was dropped on Nagasaki. And so I encourage you guys to do some research on the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer, the movie Oppenheimer, was made about the Manhattan Project. And you will have a primary source to read. It's a letter from Albert Einstein to FDR, letting him know about the creation of potential bombs and how the United States might want to get involved. And so we will talk more about that a little bit later. I'm going to table that one because this is, like I said, this is a lengthy presentation, and there's a lot of other things we're going to discuss first. And so that brings us to Israel. And, I'm not really sure how you can discuss all the events of World War II and the Holocaust and not discuss the creation of Israel as a Jewish state as a culmination of the war. And so I'm going to give you guys just a brief history of the Jews and how Zionism came to be. I hope you guys enjoy this part. So in 1917, towards the end of World War I, following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was occupied by British forces. Palestine is basically the Arabic word for Israel. And so the United Kingdom was granted control of the area west of the Jordan River that now comprises the state of Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and on the East Bank, what later became Jordan by the Versailles Peace Conference, which established the League of Nations in 1919. Okay, so you may want to pause and just kind of look at all of this on a map and make sure you've got all this down. And what I'm going to give you is a lot of information here. And so you can see it here. Israel, if you're not sure, is located here. You've got the Arabian Peninsula here. Egypt is here. And so, yeah, you can see it better on this map. Gaza is here. Gaza was an Egyptian territory for a while. And what you've got here in 1947 is you've got the Jewish state and the Arab state. And a movie that you might want to consider watching is called 1913 Seeds of Conflict. If you really want to understand how the Jews began returning to Israel, it explains that pretty well, and how Jews and Arabs lived fairly peacefully side by side for a time. And it explains how the conflict escalated and kind of the roots. When it says seeds of conflict, 1913 seeds of conflict, it really tries to go back to the roots of the origin of the problem. And way back in the Middle Ages and late antiquity, and in other times in history, the Jews actually really enjoyed living with the Muslims in a lot of different scenarios because the Muslims were more tolerant of Jews than the Christians were. In a lot of Christianized places, they wanted to turn the Jews into Christians. They felt like they had a duty to proselytize the Jews to help them understand why the Old Testament points to Jesus Christ as the Savior. And so the Jews a lot of times felt threatened by that. They felt forced. And so they would often side with the Muslims. Muslims also wanted them to convert as well, but a lot of times they were a little bit more forgiving of that kind of thing. And they would just put tariffs on the Jews and other regulations. And the question is, which country is it going to be easier for us to tolerate, right? And a lot of times it was the Arabs. And so it's kind of interesting how this all escalated when the Jews started coming back. And the idea that the Jews would come back and repopulate is called Zionism. The actual term for that is called Zionism. And so you have what's known as the Balfour Declaration. It was a public statement issued by the British government in 1917 during the First World War, and they announced support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And so it was then an Ottoman region, and it had a very small minority Jewish population. And so you can kind of see in this letter, Mr. Balfour has sent the following letter to Lord Rothschild in regard to the establishment of a national home in Palestine for the Jewish people. And you might want to also look up the Biltmore Conference. They came up with a declaration about this. But he says, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. And so the idea here is that when you have millions of people who were persecuted, who were put into gas chambers, and when they came out, I don't know if any of you have done the extra credit assignment and watched any of the Holocaust survivor stories. I hope that you guys did. And I may extend that another week if you guys want to take the time to do that. Then you really see like Richfeld's story. Okay, he had to enter a survivors camp. So a lot of them left concentration camps and just went to a survivors camp. And then, the global powers are wondering what to do with all these displaced people who are starving, who have no means to provide for themselves. And this is really the creation of the modern welfare state in a lot of ways. FDR and his New Deal were coming out of the Great Depression, and, there's a need to provide for all of these people. Well, how can you prevent anything like this from happening again? Give Israel their land, right? And then perhaps this problem will be abated. And I guess, technically what we're seeing today is it just brought in new issues, right? New things to deal with. But at the time, there was much sympathy for the Jews because of what had happened to them. And so Herbert Samuel, a former postmaster general in the British cabinet who was instrumental in drafting the Balfour Declaration, was appointed the first High Commissioner of Palestine. And so during World War I, the British mandate made two promises regarding territory in the Middle East. Britain promised the local Arabs through Lawrence of Arabia independence for a united Arab country covering most of the Arab Middle East in exchange for supporting the British, and Britain had promised to create and foster a Jewish national home as laid out in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Now, fast forward in 1947, following increasing levels of violence, the British government expressed a wish to withdraw from Palestine. Now, the proposed plan of partition would have split Palestine into two states. You probably have heard the phrase two-state solution, and so this is kind of where that comes from. If you haven't, you should be familiar with it just because of current events and things like that. You've got this two-state solution. And so you have an Arab state and a Jewish state. And the city of Jerusalem is of it's a major problem, right? Because who gets the capital city? And so they gave slightly more than half the land area to the proposed Jewish state. And immediately following the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of a resolution recommending the adoption and implementation of the partition plan and the subsequent declaration of statehood by the Jewish National Council, you have a civil war that broke out between the Arab community and the Jewish community. And so, as armies of the Arab League, which rejected the partition plan, which Israel accepted, sought to squelch the new Jewish state. So then you have the armies of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. They marched into the territory of what had just ceased to be the British mandate. By December of 1948, Israel controlled most of the portion of Palestine west of the Jordan River. And the remainder of the mandate came to be called the West Bank, controlled by the Jordan, and you have the Gaza Strip controlled by Egypt. Now, prior to and during this conflict, 711,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled or fled from their homes to become Palestinian refugees. Now, one third went to the West Bank and one third to the Gaza Strip, occupied by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, and the rest to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and other countries. After the establishment of Israel, you have an immigration of Holocaust survivors from Europe and a large influx of Jewish refugees from Arab countries doubled Israel's population within 1 year of its independence. Overall, the following years, you have about 850,000 Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Sephardic are Jews from Spain, Mizrahi are Jews from the Middle East. They fled or were expelled from Arab countries, Iran, and Afghanistan. And of those, about 680,000 settled in Israel. Yemenite Jews in Ma'abarat, which is an absorption camp, and Rosh Ha'ayin in 1950. So Israel's Jewish population continued to grow at a very high rate for years, fed by waves of Jewish immigration from around the world, including the massive immigration wave of Soviet Jews who arrived in Israel in the 1990s. That was according to the Law of Return. And some 380,000 Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union arrived in 1990 and 91 alone. So that kind of catches us up to speed with the war, with Jewish history in general. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this presentation. Like I said, I know it was lengthy, and I appreciate you hanging out with us to the end. If you have questions, don't be afraid to reach out, and I'm always here to help if you need anything. And I value your feedback as well about the course. And I hope that you guys have a wonderful week.